Hello, everybody on the Zoom call, and hello, everybody out in Facebook land. I'm really delighted to be with all of you tonight here for this event with Leigh Joseph of Squamish Botanicals. I am going to open our event by expressing my gratitude that we're able to gather tonight on the shared traditional unceded territories of the Squamish Nation and the Styawat Nation. We're very lucky to live, work, and play on these territories. And we would love to know if you're watching from elsewhere, if you're watching from a different territory, we would love to know that. So whether you are in the Zoom call or over on Facebook, you're welcome to comment and let us know where you're watching from, because we always love to know that. And I am not going to do a ton more talking, but I will let you know that regardless of where you're watching from, Zoom or Facebook, hello everybody, you will have a chance to ask questions to Leigh after her presentation. So we will ask that you save your questions until the end of the presentation. It'll be very obvious, I promise. You'll know when we're taking questions. And I will be looking at both the Zoom chat box and also the comments over on Facebook. So we will try to answer as many of your questions as possible this evening. Oh, hey, by the way, I'm Jeanette Bruce, if you don't know me. I'm the program coordinator at Whistler Public Library. Okay, that is enough talking from me. I am really delighted to welcome Leigh Joseph to present her talk this evening. I have tried and enjoyed many of Leigh's products from Squamish Botanicals over the last year, and I've loved them all. But I'm really excited to hear some of her background and how she came to be working in this field, and also, of course, the Indigenous perspective on the role of plants in her work. So Leigh, please go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. So Leigh Joseph Tanachan Tala Squamish o Chomeo, on Wanoxton Squalowin Eochtin Sequatal. My name is Leigh Joseph, my ancestral Styawat, and I'm really happy to be here with everybody tonight. I'll tell you a little more about myself as I get into the presentation, but the title of the talk that I'm going to share is Gathering Meta Perspective on the Role of Culturally Important Plants, Indigenous Resurgence. So yeah, I'll just, oh, is it going to let me, I probably have to do it there. There we go. So a little bit about who I am. I'm a mother to two very spirited young children, Ava and Jake, who are 5 and 7. And this has become a major part of my life, of course, and who I am, as well as another reason behind the work that I did 7 years becoming a mother. I hold my master's in science from the University of Victoria, botany. And over the past, I would say about 8 to 9 years, I've been working in Indigenous communities, including Squamish and other territories, focusing on the link between health and traditional plant use. So I'm currently working towards my PhD in ethnobotany, and I'm also an entrepreneur, and I'll talk a little bit about that path that I've taken in my plant-based learning experiences. And I love plants, which you will gather from my talk. So what is ethnobotany? Ethnobotany is the study of the direct interrelationships between people and plants. So it's really more the uses of plants. And in the early stages of the field of ethnobotany, really coming from a perspective of, how can we use plants? What are they good for? That kind of sort of utilitarian approach. And so something that I'm really looking at from the research side of things is how is it that we shift that understanding from sort of uses to relationships. We all have connections to plants in one way or another. And I invite you to think about a plant that is important to you. It doesn't have to be just one, but maybe a plant that you enjoy walking past, or something that you put in your garden each year, or maybe it's a plant that you share a memory with a family member, something that brings back, memories from maybe childhood, or something that connects to you. And I just invite you to keep this plant in your mind as we go through this conversation, and maybe think about the ways that this plant has, I guess, become a part of your life and how you're in relationship with it. So I've been taught by elders in my own community, as well as other knowledge holders. And more recently, I've lived and worked in other Indigenous communities. So I lived in Tahltan territory for 4 years, which is in northern BC, and then in Sţawat territory in the Yukon for 3 years. And so both of these experiences really brought me the opportunity to, oh, the kids are knocking at the door, really brought me the opportunity to learn from a new landscape and learn about a whole different set of plants. So in university, I learned, from a sort of botany standpoint, how to identify plants, how to categorize them, how to name them in Latin. And it was really important to me to receive that opinion, or that foundation of scientific knowledge, Western scientific knowledge, because I really wanted to be able to understand more about the chemistry and the biology and botany of these plants. And then when I finished my master's, I really recognized that I really needed rebuilding of relationships with plants. That was really going to be very important for me to engage in. So in these other territories, I learned from elders and knowledge holders by approaching the community in a really respectful way, in an open-minded and open-hearted way, and question of how can I bring my skill set to the work that's already happening, or to the work that the community itself is inspiring. That's a really important practice in how I engage in communities from a research perspective. And that's very different and contrasting to earlier research practices, which and some ongoing as well, really looks at asserting a question and a framework and sort of making that happen. So when working in Indigenous communities, it's really important in my mind to really ask the questions first of how your work and knowledge and research can help uplift the community in whatever area of knowledge it is that you're working with. Connecting to the land equals healing Indigenous body. This is speaking to the fact that, in recent colonial history, there's been a lot of pointed effort to put a barrier between Indigenous people and the land, essentially. So whether it was through privatization, through having an Indian agent on the reserve that would need to give out passes, to actually leave for something that was deemed to be, valuable, which harvesting certainly was not for a long time. This reconnection to the land is really central to my own personal healing, my own personal learning and reconnecting with plants, as well as what I'm trying to contribute to with my research, which is just providing as many opportunities to reconnect with land as possible, and understanding that act of spending time on the land, and for my work, it's most often through harvesting, that really translates to healing and strengthening, as land is a really core part of Indigenous people's identities. And I say that without assuming that I can speak for all Indigenous people, but in the communities that I've worked with, this is a really common thread. Even if there's a lot of diversity across language, law, cultural practices, this connection, traditional homelands is really profound. So the premise of the work and especially my doctoral work that I'm looking at right now is that it is our inherent right as Indigenous people to access healthy foods, medicine, and to spend time on our traditional lands. And in addition to that, to define our own health and wellness definitions and practices. And I bring this in because, I am studying ethnobotany, so I'm looking at, I absolutely love, the sort of the identification part and understanding, botany, and then sort of also how to utilize plants, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the framework for how it is that I'm re-engaging with plants in my own life and within the communities I work with is really looking at, how do these plants link to a cultural view of health, and what about the act of going out on a trail and recognizing a plant that you start to build relationship with over time. Maybe at some point you harvest that plant and you create something to nourish yourself, either through a food or a medicine or a topical wellness product, something like that. And so this is really one of the foundations that I keep coming back to, is this right to assert our own cultural perspectives on health. And I'm not an expert within the area of public health by any means, but I've had to read outside of my field a lot in order to draw on other Indigenous voices and perspectives. And often what comes across is that, in terms of who is defining health or social determinants of health, it's often not necessarily coming from within the community. So this is something from a plant-based perspective that I'm thinking about a lot right now. One shift that I like to take whenever I'm teaching a university class, or really trying to discuss this idea of relationships, is shifting the definition of plants from a resource to a relative. And so when we think about the cedar tree outside of our house as a relative versus a resource. So when we think about a resource, some of the things that might come to mind are lumber, building with it, the cost of it, economically. And then when we shift to looking at that cedar tree as a relative, happens when we shift that mental shift. And it's a question that I'm posing, to all of you to think about, and something that, really captures a lot of the teachings that have been shared with me from, elders in my community and other communities, is that when we look at how we're in relationship with plants, and so I back to plants, of course, it's not limited to only plants, but non-human life. When we look at these relations on the landscape, how do we look at rebuilding full and reciprocal relationships with plants? So this would be where we take care of the land that we live on, we take care of the health of the plants, and we also take care of our own health. This image is a drawing, and I should say the previous image too, is an illustration or a drawing by Squamish and Skszwx artist Ocean Highland. And I've worked with her on a number of illustrations through my research, because I'm not artistically inclined to work with her to find ways to represent this reclamation and the strength of what it means. So in the hand, the person is holding nettle, devil's club, and cedar. So 3 really important medicines and foods that really support health across sort of all aspects. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. And then in this image, the person's hand is tending to a plant called camas, or in Squamish, it's banana. And this is an important root vegetable that was cultivated and widely it grows primarily on southern Vancouver and in Gulf Islands on Garry Oak Meadow ecosystems. But this was a plant that was present in Squamish, probably trade, but that grew on some of the islands and some of the drier sites. So connecting to plants. This is something that I've mentioned that is really has been a part of my own learning, and I think really came into play after I'd finished my my undergrad in biology and my master's, I'd put so much work into just getting the the courses I needed. I didn't do any science courses or math courses in high school, so it was really a very focused set of years where I really needed to look at just studying and really a lot of cerebral and sort of head-centered learning. And as I mentioned, when I came out of my master's, I recognized that my hands-on relationships with these plants wasn't necessarily, it wasn't there in the same way. And it was actually at a conference I went to on Bainbridge Island. I was invited to go and give a talk on my master's research, which looking at renewing Chexw in Squamish, or northern rice root, the Latin name is Fritillaria campsichensis, into the Squamish estuary. So it's a plant that's still growing in the estuary, but has been very impacted. And so I went to this conference to share about how it was that we looked at building restoration gardens in the estuary and transplanting these plants from across the Squamish River. There's some of these plants still growing, and we were able to salvage some from an eroded bank. Anyways, and bring them over and work with repopulating areas with this plant. And so I showed up and I had my PowerPoint and everything ready. And then I noticed that every other session was either people were heading outside or they were working in a really hands-on way with plants. And I remember it was that moment where I recognized that that was what I really wanted, and that was what I really needed to round out this more cerebral and academic path. And so that's led me to this this question and this exploration of how is it that we connect to place through plants. And so another part of that is really building relationships. So when I look at this picture, this is the bloom of chexw. So chexw is the plant that I mentioned in the illustration before, is a really key culturally important food. So it's the bulbs of this plant that are harvested and managed really intensively. And so the management of this plant involves things like prescribed burning, so burning the field to make sure that it stays as an open meadow ecosystem to allow for chexw and other bulb plants to really flourish. And that in turn creates a really rich hunting grounds that a lot of life comes to nourished. And then in terms of the relationship in this plant, people who would harvest this would be so familiar with the meadow and the intensively cultivated field that they were harvesting from, that you could pick on an individual basis which bulbs were ready and which ones you would leave for the next year. And I was speaking with a friend of mine who's from Lekwungen territory. She's from the Squamish First Nations, and she's been doing a lot of work with restoring chexw on the landscape. And she's been doing, basically just going into urban areas, residential areas, municipal parks for years to rebuild her relationship with this. Easy. She's come up against a lot of sort of judgment and people telling her that she is loud, but it's this relationship has been so important for her to rebuild. And she was telling me last year that in her exploring of these chexw meadows, and that includes weeding them, digging them up, a lot of these plants respond really well to a certain amount of disturbance. So when you dig up, say, northern rice root or chexw, and you replant sections of those bulbs, they come back in a way that's just so much more productive than when they are left to grow on their own. So this management is a really important piece of the relationship. And something she was observing that was repeating itself was there was these flat stones that were under some of the bulbs. And as she learned more about this plant and the how it works in the plant or the soil profile is that the bulb itself looks like a shallot, like kind of like a small onion. But in the early years of its growth, it can elongate to like the size of a pencil. So what it does is it elongates and it moves itself down in the soil profile, whether it be to access more water. And so what she said is that some of the harvesters would put a flat rock underneath the bulbs that were ready the next year, basically so they couldn't, escape down into the soil profile. And so in her story, it unpacks what it, what it starts to mean to be in relationship. So she knows where to find this plant relative. She knows where it grows. She knows how to tend to it to help provide the habitat that this plant, thrives under, and the relationship, that interrelationship piece, and that reciprocity, how it gives back. And so one thing that she's been working really hard at is reinstating some small prescribed burning in camas meadows, which is, as you can imagine, it's very difficult with current relationships, with fire and the density that we have, our communities in now. It's very difficult to get permission essentially to do that. But the times that she's been able to do prescribed burns, she said, the camas meadows just explode in waiting, for that piece of that interrelationship to come back. So this is what I think about when I think about what does it mean to build relationships with plants. And often, for me as a researcher and a teacher, I've worked with my own community and other communities, as well as in a university setting. And often, I see my role as, how is it that I plant seeds, whether it be, planting the seeds of learning or interest or connectivity, we'll talk about how is it that it's culture, how is it that it's connected to an understanding of the impacts of colonization on this particular area of knowledge. How is it that it's connected to health? And for younger people, often like working with children, it's also, you never know what it is that sparks that interest. And for me, when I thought about I didn't know what I wanted to do when I left high school in terms of post-secondary, and I went into a career in outdoor guiding for some years, and then I really started to think about my childhood, and I started to think about the memories that I had with my great aunt and uncle from my Nanaimo or Nanaimo side of my family. My grandmother on my father's side is from Nanaimo. And I thought about when I was young, how we would go visit them a lot at their house along the Nanaimo River, and I would spend time with he's my great uncle, but I called him my Grandpa Chester, in his smokehouse, helping him hang salmon, and out in the dugout canoe that he was a dugout canoe builder. So we would go out fishing on the river, and then we would share these meals around their kitchen table. And I'm 5 years older than my next sibling. So I have a lot of memories from kind of quite a young age of just, being the only kid there and sitting and listening to Chester and Eva speak their Indigenous language, smelling the wood smoke from the fire, sharing this meal that was one of the first meals, really, or memories that I have of having a hand in helping, prepare something from planting through to the processing and then cooking and, plating it and sitting down and sharing a meal. And so for me, I realized much later in life that this was something that stayed with me, and it was something that really fed me in terms of, what it is that I wanted to capture, what it is that I wanted to, sort of ignite more of in the world, is this meeting together of caring for family and for yourself and for the land through the plant foods and medicines that we're in relationship with. So another teaching that's been shared with me has been that, there really needs to be a focus on youth and involvement of youth at every point possible. One of my teachers, Chum, who's an elder here in Squamish, really emphasized this for me. He recognized that in our traditional teachings, sometimes knowledge wasn't shared with everyone. It wasn't meant for everybody. Certain families may hold particular knowledge, and he didn't want to, disrespect, that approach. But what he said is, it's really important now that we share, and we share widely, especially with our youth. And to me, that really resonated because of the story I just told you, that it was an event or a series of events in my youth that really led me to follow this path, which has been, such a inspiring and grounding and nourishing path for me to take in my life, of reconnecting with plant knowledge in the way that I have been. So this is something that I really focus on in all of the work I do, is how is it that we can involve youth? And of course, the perspectives and the way that kids absorb information and experiences is really so inspiring to watch and to be a part of. So a lot of what my research looks like is sharing experiences and sharing knowledge. And this is one of my absolute favorite things to do, is just to go out on the land with community members, elders, and knowledge holders, and just share in the experiences that come from that. So this was when I was living in Tahltan territory with a good friend of mine, Fanny Lindstrom, who's an elder and knowledge holder in that territory. And she also, made sure to always be going out with the youth and with the school to her harvesting areas and sharing about her medicine. And in this particular field trip, we were talking about alder root medicine and how it is that she utilizes this, how she harvests it, ethically and respectfully. And we spent a day out at her harvest spot, and it was just these experiences that you can't structure really. You can make plans, but it's really just about creating the opportunity and seeing where that day takes you and what it is that's shared. And it's been such an important part of education and what it means to pursue education, and how that many different forms. Another focus of mine, I didn't grow up in Squamish, in Victoria, and so I spent a lot of time to Squamish, throughout my childhood, and my family and I have moved back here just in the last couple of years. And something that I really wanted to see as part of our community gatherings was plant celebration. And so for the last 3 years, we've been holding a traditional plant celebration at Totem Hall for community members. And it's been an opportunity to work in a really hands-on way together, to go out to, talk about how to identify plants. So in this particular slide, we're working with Devil's Club bark. So going out, talking about the habitat and the ecology of where this plant grows, how to start, understanding and recognizing the patterns and what areas certain plants grow in. And then, really talking about what it means to harvest. And that isn't me telling everybody how to do it. I share, the learnings and teachings that I have in terms of how to do that. And that, often look like, ensuring that I'm in a good space of mind and in my heart when I do go out and I engage with this plant relative. Thanks to this, plant for the medicine or the food that it's providing. That when I do that, that my mind and heart are in a good place. And so if I'm making a medicine, making a food, then that's the kind of energy that will go into that. A good energy and a positive energy. Another part of that is, that sometimes when we do go out to harvest, sometimes the answer, is no in a certain area. So I've been in places, I've gone out with the intention of harvesting a particular medicine, and you get to the place and maybe the stand, isn't very healthy, or it's not very expanded. These plants, Devil's Club is a good example, can quite easily be highly impacted by overharvesting. Really essential, especially with all of the development and habitat loss that has happened in recent decades. It's really important to look at how it is that we give back as well. And so often that's, understanding a little more about the ecology or, biology of a certain plant in terms of how it reproduces. How can you, can you plant out cuttings? Can you plant out sections of the bulb to have population back? Something that I also really like to discuss and work on in my own my own work that I do is collaborating with native plant nurseries and other people who are growing these plants in ways where you're not necessarily taking from wild populations, and you're putting these plants back out onto the landscape, whether it be in your garden or part of a larger kind of restoration or community garden. And another key, I saw that Henry was on the call here. That's you chopping Devil's Club bark in a workshop that we did. Oh gosh, probably about 4 or 5 years ago now. And so sharing these teachings with community is something that has been really emphasized to me by my aunt, my Auntie Leigh Joseph McCullough, who's been an absolute guide to me in terms of to be a researcher within my own community, and also how to reconnect, to my own community, given that I didn't grow up here. And so that's been a very interesting process to go through. But it always just makes sense to me, the most sense when I'm out on the land with people in community. So being a researcher, of course, I'm doing lots of various presentations and consultations and interviews and whatnot, moments where we're out sharing, and it really is sharing back and forth in terms of learning from community members like Henry, and learning from in terms of how it is that they view rebuilding these relationships. It's a really wonderful experience. So in terms of my my master's work that I mentioned, and my ongoing doctoral research, a lot of my focus and framework, as I mentioned, is looking at health and how do we look at health from a Squamish perspective? What does it mean? And so that often looks different than maybe what is being put out there, say in food guides or in documents that might be coming more from a Western medical perspective. And that's not to dismiss or undermine those knowledges that are very key and important, but it's to add in this idea of when we engage with our natural environment, when we rebuild these relationships with plants, and then when we bring these plants back into our lives, how does that impact our health, and how does that impact how we view our health? And so a lot of my master's research was really focused on looking at food. So in this slide, the upper central photo is of chexw, or rice root, Fritillaria campsichensis bulb. So you see where the common name rice root comes from. It looks like a bunch of rice grains kind of stuck together. And chexw is in the lily family. And understanding a little more about the botany of this plant, I learned that each of those little bulblets can reproduce vegetatively within a year. So if you plant them out, they all, send up an initial leaf and then start to divide themselves and grow into a mature plant. This plant takes about 5 to 7 years to reproduce by seed. So in terms of restoration strategy, it's really helpful to have that information. And it's also really helpful to, as we rebuild cultural relationships with this plant, one of the main ways is to not harvest it, to manage it, to learn about it, to educate, our community members and the broader community about, really coming together to protect this plant, its habitat, and, do everything that we can to get this plant, its populations back. And so the first time actually was a couple of years ago at the plant celebration. My Auntie Joy said, I really want to have flasum, rice table. And we knew that we couldn't do that in any large volume. But I, of course, what my Auntie Joy asks, I'm always sure to do. And so we went across the river and harvested a few bulbs, and I stripped the bulblets off, and then I replanted the central corm. So you can see in the picture, there's some little roots coming out the base. If you replant that in Sṃwx, it's called the gagump. I don't know about a Squamish word for it, but the gagump translates to grandfather. And the management practice of replanting that bulb regenerating and then flowering practice that that I've been sharing and teaching in this area as well. And so I took some of those bulblets and I washed them off, and then I added them to a seafood soup and had it at the table. The power of just having a small amount of this culturally important food back at the table for the first time, definitely in a century, probably more. This is a plant that cultivated intensively and actively in estuary root gardens here in Squamish. And we had 3 villages in the Squamish estuary, because estuaries are such productive sites. And so the act of bringing this plant back into the Squamish diet, it was so interesting. People were fishing around in their soup and so excited to get one of these bulblets. But it shifted. I felt it personally, and I talked with other people too. It shifts something in terms of how it is that we value our own health, that we view health. So plant foods have this healing capacity. So certainly physically, they're very healthful foods. Traditional diet here in Squamish territory would have been incredibly rich in, in fibers, in healthy oils and fats. These root vegetables were a very important source of carbohydrate that was very difficult to come. And so when I look at, reconnecting to cultural foods, it's not so much about, okay, how is it that we get back to this diet? Because that's, it's difficult. There's a lot of, barriers there, but it's what can we add in, and what can we reconnect with through this process of building relationships that can even shift, how it is that we think about the relationship between, culturally important foods and health. And so I'm, again, talking about objective, but there are, many other aspects and ways of approaching this. But so in this photo, there's the again, that beautiful purple bloom. In the middle, there's the fresh green nettle tops. And then to the side of that, there's a lot of red huckleberries and trailing blackberries. And above that, Pacific crabapple and rosehip, which are both in season right now. And then below the red huck is red laver seaweed. And this is drying the seaweed into cakes that can be that were preserved in bentwood boxes and utilized throughout the potlatch season. This was in Squamish territory with an elder that I learned a lot from in that territory, who is from Kinkum Inlet. And then on the bottom corner, the long stringy roots is springbank clover, which is another really important estuary root vegetable that's found in Squamish and other estuary cultivated estuaries. And then the big picture of the bulbs is of camas that I mentioned earlier. So last year, well, it seems like longer than that, but last year we had the first camas pit cook in Squamish in over a century. So this is similar to the the hlasam or rice root, welcoming that back into the feast table. This was in collaboration with Cheryl Bryce, who I had mentioned from the Kwang territory on southern Vancouver Island. And she and some other people that I've collaborated with on the island in some courses that I teach at UVic donated camas bulbs. And so they showed up with a big, satchel full of these camas bulbs. And myself and my relatives here, on my left, is Chum, the teacher who I mentioned to you, who I've learned a lot from since I've started down this path of learning about ethnobotany and connecting to plants. And he's taking one of the bulbs there from the pit cook. And so pit cooking is a traditional method of cooking where you dig a hole in the ground and you heat up river rocks until they're red hot, and then you put them in the base of the pit. You layer on top foliage like salal, thimbleberry leaves that has been soaked in water, and sword ferns. Some of the food is wrapped in skunk cabbage leaves. And so you layer that water-soaked foliage, and then you put your food and some more water-soaked foliage and food, and you kind of layer it like that. And then at the very end, you pour water right down to the rocks, and then you cover the pit. Now we use burlap. Actually, it would be cattail mats. So cattails grow in the estuary, and piece of cattail mat. And so cover it with the mat, and then cover it with soil until there's no more steam escaping, and then you leave it there to cook. And the sort of special thing about camas is that when the bulbs are cooking, they take at least 24 hours to cook. And so what happens is if you were to bite into an undercooked camas bulb, it would be a starchy mess. It would be stuck to your teeth. And I can attest this because I have done this, and stuck to the roof of your mouth, just not a good experience. And the starch in these camas bulbs is something called inulin, which really isn't pleasant or available to us from a nutritional standpoint. And so by cooking the bulbs for 24 hours, that inulin fructose, which is a much more flavorful and readily available form of starch for us to digest. And the bulbs themselves caramelize this incredible, flavor. And so I had camas for the first time 2 years. And again, it was that of, okay, this isn't just me having another meal. This is me eating a food that has been cultivated and traded and has ceremony connected to it and connected to it. And here I am taking this, into my body for nourishment. And that is a really profound experience, and some, captures what it means to be in relationship, to understand, where it is these plants are living, how it is that we, as Indigenous people or as Squamish people or Lekwungen people have cultivated these relationships over thousands and thousands of years. And so another aspect, if you look at many ethnobotany books, often you look at like breaking plants down into foods, medicines, and materials. So when we think about plants as medicine, again, this quote underneath, our food is our medicine, really speaks to often, what you find is that these plants are both potentially food and medicines. And not all of them, but a plant like stinging nettle, for example, is an incredible spring food. it's also a medicine, whether you take it in the form of food or whether you, make a tea out of it, or a topical medicine, or, more recently a tincture. And so, these plants are so much to us. And of course, in terms of like the biology of the plants, it's compounds. So it's the natural chemicals and compounds that these plants produce, beyond what they require for photosynthesis, that we benefit from, that our bodies really benefit from. And so stinging nettle, for example, is an incredible anti-inflammatory. And this is one plant again that taught me about, and that he uses and has used for years to help with arthritic joints. And so I've worked with Chum and other elders who will pick this plant fresh and they'll hit their sore joints with it. And what happens is, yes, there's a stinging response, or you get a sting, and your body responds by flushing, the joint with oxygenated blood and antihistamines, and that anti-inflammatory action can really take place. And something that Chum shared with me is that, when we're utilizing a medicine, we can take that internally and also use it topically to treat any ailments that we may be targeting. And so, in terms of my research, I'm really looking at plant medicine as supporting all aspects of health. And so when I say that, I mean that, yes, it supports physical health, but it also supports mental health and spiritual health. So by re-engaging with these, plant relatives and these plant relations, by rebuilding relationships with them so that we respect and understand what it is that they need to thrive, and we build our own respectful and reciprocal relationships with how we may be harvesting or managing and tending to these plants, all of that connects to what it means to me as a Squamish woman to be healthy, and so really a really important part of the research that I do. So I realize we're at about the 50-minute mark, but I wanted to share just a little bit about, I'd mentioned the entrepreneurial path that I'm also on. So I just wanted to share some images from that. So I founded Squamish Botanicals 3 years ago, and it was actually under a different name, Botanicals, rebranded under Squamish last September, and just over a year ago. And this came into my life as a creative outlet for this research that I do, for a way to honor and uplift or hold up the the beauty of what it is to reconnect to landscape through plants, and to reconnect to health and wellness through plants. So the vision for my business is to elevate Indigenous voices, images, and lives through beauty, self-care rituals that are rooted in Indigenous plant science. This business has offered me basically a forum and a place to share a lot of what it is that I'm reflecting on and learning from in my research, kind of world, and my role as a doctoral student and educator in the field of ethnobotany. And it's been an extension reconnection. So each of these products has a Squamish name, and I'm not a language speaker. A whole other topic that talk about for a very long in terms of languages have been impacted. But there are big efforts going on in our Squamish community to reconnect to language. And so we have now a Squamish language dictionary. My sister is in the 3rd year of her Squamish language immersion. And so there are resources for me to turn to learn about the plant names. And that's been a way for me to connect to language, and a way to bring it to a wider audience. And I was a little intimidated, because I thought, well, people are going to look at this and say, well, I don't know how to say that. But what I've found is that it's also just a design element. The beauty of these words, it's not necessarily about, oh, can I say this properly? It's a recognition that this is, you know, a word that holds a lot of meaning. It's something that, you know, is a connection point. So again, another, you know, important aspect has been building, for me, has been building a sustainable Indigenous skincare business that's grounded in Indigenous respect and knowledge of plants. So again, some more images. The bottom image of my sister and our friend Keisha and myself in red dresses, you know, really speaks to a connected issue of, you know, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And just the, you know, how that is so connected to our land-based knowledge and identities and the impacts that those have sustained over decades. And then on top of that, the stereotypes and the images that are put on Indigenous women. And so by having the chance to capture, you know, some of this imagery in my own way and, you know, bring the business way of building, you know, broader understandings and connection and conversation has been really important and really inspiring, and, you know, just a really nice way to collaborate. So a pillar of my business is the sustainable harvesting. And I mentioned before, you know, because this is business endeavor, I'm very aware of how to continue to keep myself, you know, in check about how I do this respectfully and sustainably. And so one way that I've been doing that is collaborating, again, like I mentioned, with native plant nurse to either purchase some, you know, plants that I grow myself, or to also look at, you know, planting these plants back out onto the landscape. And one example last spring was working with Cultural Journeys, which is a Squamish elementary school program. And we planted out, you know, 350 Indigenous plant species into an area where the students from that program can now go and harvest from. And similarly, there was another school local here where we did the same thing. So it's really looking at how to give back. And then I've also partnered with a friend who has an organic farm, and she's been able to grow some of these botanicals for my business specifically. And again, just really looking at ways to create, you know, clean and effective products that are plant-based and that celebrate these relationships. And so I wanted to just share the images from that aspect of the work that I do, where this work is leading me. And then another, you know, central part is giving back to my family, to the land, and to community. And I think that that's been, you know, emphasized in this presentation. On my left, my son and I were harvesting nettle one day this spring, and he's just so proud of his, you know, identification of the plant, of his harvesting, and he is the best little harvester that you know, now with. He's so focused and really helped me through the processing and the making the various things that we made with nettle. And in the center, I was teach a workshop, a land-based camp up in Sţawat territory in the Yukon. And that for me was a way of, you know, collaborating and giving back to a community that had, you know, welcomed me and shared with me as well. And then on the other side is the planting out of, you know, all of those that I'd mentioned last spring. So I want to raise my hands and say thank you, Sḳwx, for listening to me. And yeah, I'm happy to kind of move on from here with questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Leigh. We've covered a lot of ground, so I'm sure folks will have questions. Now, I'm going to remind everybody on Zoom, there's a lot of you, so please don't unmute yourself or we may have chaos on our hands. But I'll ask, if you're on Zoom and you have a question, please use the chat feature. And you can send your messages to everyone, or you could just send them to me. Either way, I'll make sure that I ask them out loud for Leigh. And if you're watching on Facebook, then you can comment on the live video, and I will be monitoring that feed as well. Now, there's actually a question here already from one of our Zoom viewers. So Leigh, I'll jump in with that one. And it's about your pit cook of the camas roots. How do you keep the rocks red hot for 24 hours? What's the process?
Yeah, so good question. I've never, okay, that's not true. I have led a pit cook, but I've mostly been with veteran pit cook leaders. So Cheryl Bryce, who I mentioned, has led many pit cooks. And when you're putting, like, there's the time of digging the hole, of gathering the rocks, of heating them up in the fire. Then once it's go time, it's like lightning quick. Everybody is, poised and ready with their job. So you kind of line up, you have the people who are going to scoop the rocks into the pit. And then you have the people ready with their soaked foliage to put it on top. So all in all, once those red hot rocks go in, the pit is closed within, under 2 minutes, ideally. So when that happens, you certainly lose some, some heat over the cooking time. But the more, basically the more, or the important process of putting that dirt on top until you don't see any steam really seals everything in. And so we've cooked everything from, market vegetables like yams, potatoes, through to elk steaks or salmon. And so depending on how fast things cook, you layer them differently. And then the camas itself, there has been some experiments done on how the temperature changes over that 24 hours. It really is incredible in terms of how it holds that heat in there. That being said, if you don't seal it properly, or something, it takes too long, you are going to have a much colder pit. And I've had that happen once. And we also didn't leave things in long. We opened it up and things were really undercooked. So it was a learning experience, albeit a bit of a disappointing one, but so much of this has been.
In the same vein, Leigh, I'm wondering about your experience cooking the rice root. Is that correct? With the one that you put in the soup? Did you seek out advice about how to prepare that? That's the small amount that you used for that meal?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I did. So I spoke with the elder that I'd mentioned, Sďawat from Kingcome Inlet, from Sďawat territory. He has had memory of harvesting this plant with his grandmother and of eating it and preparing it. And so it's a plant that doesn't take much to prepare. So it's very different from camas in that you can cook it quite easily. So I got advice from him, as well as, reading through snippets and pieces from ethnographies about how this plant had been eaten traditionally. And then it's also, was experimentation. And so really learning, how to work with that plant. And so I've been to a pit cook in Kingcome Inlet where rice root had been pit cooked, and it had been put right on the top layer, so the furthest away from the hot rocks, in little thimbleberry leaf pockets. So you can fold a thimbleberry leaf and sort of the stem through to kind of make a little envelope, because all of those little bulblets, you want to keep them together. And so that was the way that I had eaten them before. And then in the soup, it was really neat to see, because I kind of thought they might just disintegrate and fall apart, but they're actually very robust. So they cooked and then they kind of stayed in like a barley almost.
Very nice. It sounds delicious. We have another question from our Zoom audience. This is a tough one. This might be like asking about your favorite child, but this person on the Zoom call says, I know you're in love with all plants, but what plant is most precious or special to you?
That is fun. Well, maybe that one. No one. No, that. No, I would say at this point, in terms of a medicine, Devil's Club is a really important plant to me and to many other people. It holds a lot of ceremonial and spiritual importance, and right now in my mind, that's one that has been just really, really ground, almost like a guide to me in a sense, of, teaching me about, harvesting a plant that really sort of demands, a respectful and a reciprocal and sustainable harvest, as well as one that offers and provides so much in terms of action, kind of that spiritual and physical health aspects. So yeah, that's the one that comes to mind right now.
We have another question from our Zoom audience. Somebody in our call is wondering, is mushroom foraging also part of Indigenous culture in the Squamish Nation?
That's a great question. So traditionally it has been, and say that is there's vocabulary around in the Squamish Nation, so the Squamish language, and we really are time of reconnecting to this knowledge. And so I don't know of many nation members who actively harvest. Like in Squamish, I know of people in other communities who are really actively harvesting mushrooms for foods and medicines. This is an area that I'm slowly, learning about and reconnecting to. But I think definitely that particular part of knowledge has kind of the impacts that I sort of spoke, with plant knowledge, the added layer too of it. I think what is safe to say is a pretty widespread North American fear-based relationship with mushrooms, because the parts in the world, of course, where people just grow up knowing how to identify and what mushrooms, to harvest. And that's not to say that doesn't exist here, but I think we're still sort of as a society too, kind of, there's a great interest there, but building that proficiency with identification and whatnot is still, at least in my experience, still that's growing. So I would love to see it more. I would love to learn more so that I can integrate that, also like into the work that I do. And I would love to learn from other knowledgeers who engage in that. And certainly up north, where I was living most recently, chaga is a really actively used fungus for medicine, and that's something that I utilize on a regular basis, as I'm sure many other people potentially listening do as well.
It seems like it's the stakes are higher if you get your mushroom identifying wrong. Certainly that's my perception. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question here. Someone in the Zoom call is asking, you mentioned Indigenous nurseries. Are there any close to the Lower Mainland?
Yeah, so basically native plant nurseries or Indigenous plant nurseries, there's Nats, I think it's called Nats Nursery, is on the Normand. I'm trying to remember, there's another one that is escaping my memory right now. The one that I work with mostly is actually on Vancouver Island. So that's Sďawat native plants, and they are a great resource. Like, just if you even go to their website, or just Google native plant nurseries, Southern BC, there should be a list that comes up. They have really excellent resources online for just a whole wide variety of Indigenous or native plant species. And they also do a lot of really great collaborations with local Indigenous communities, and just have such a sensitivity and openness to that, supporting this work of reconnecting to plants as well. So they donated quite a few of those camas bulbs that we utilized in our pit cook last year.
We have a couple of questions, Leigh, related to books. So one person has asked, have you thought about publishing a book that might include a list of plants and their uses? And then a kind of another book themed question is, do you have any book recommendations for educators wanting to bring these subjects into their classrooms?
excellent. Yes, so I certainly have thought of, and I'm working on a book right now that's connected to my doctoral research. So it's really at the stage that it is right now. We're looking at publishing a copy for community, for consultation purposes, for getting this into various programs within the Squamish Nation to get feedback. So it's going to be a recipe field guide, for plants in the Squamish area within this context of, of my research and of health. And so that's a really exciting project. And the goal eventually is to bring that to broader publication, but it's probably a little ways off. But that is something that I'm working on. In terms of one book that just came out that I have a chapter in is a book called Plants, People, and Places. My laptop is perched on it right now, so sorry if you get rumbled around here for a second, but I can hold it up. So that's this book, Plants, People, and Places. And so that did by Dr. Nancy Turner, who's my master's supervisor and just an all-around wonderful mentor and friend. And basically anything by Dr. Nancy Turner is an excellent resource. The Earth's Blanket is one of her books that I think, because she has a lot of field guides, but The Earth's Blanket is a book that really captures some of these relationships and lots of stories from the communities that she's worked with. Nancy was one of the first people, I would say, in the field, or at least one of the first people to really prominently focus on having, like co-authors within Indigenous communities. So not simply sort of looking at people as informants, and really coming up against that, sort of rule of, maintaining anonymity, and really sort of making the argument that, this is not my knowledge, this is knowledge of the people that I'm working with, and I want to be able to credit them, accordingly. And so anything that Nancy's written is excellent. Braiding Sweetgrass is one of my favorite books, by Robin Kimmerer-Wall. She's an Indigenous biologist and botanist, and her book is just a beautiful, basically, braiding together of scientific knowledge, ecological knowledge, cultural knowledge, and just a beautiful meditation on what it is to be in relationship with plants, in different ways. In terms of identification, you're, kind of starting out or interested in just having a good general guide, Pojar and McKinnon, Plants of the Pacific Northwest, is a great book to have at all time backpack. And it just, it's just chock full of information. So those are some specific, I guess, plant-based ones. There's so many, kind of depending on what aspect you're interested in looking at, but that would be a starting place.
I'm frantically typing in. I'm looking up which of these books the library owns, and I'm happy to say that we definitely have Braiding Sweetgrass. We definitely have Plants of the Pacific Northwest. We also have The Earth's Blanket, but we don't have the new one, Plants, People, and Places. So I will make sure that the library adds that to their collection. And someone in the Zoom chat said Braiding Sweetgrass will change your life. So it had some fans. My younger brother is actually a hops farmer, and he just listened to the audiobook version, and he said he was just crying while he had it in his ears. He, couldn't recommend it highly enough.
Yeah.
We've got another question here in the Zoom chat, really interesting question on the topic of mental health. And this person asks, besides having a houseplant, like, to raise your spirits, is there an Indigenous plant that can help with stress, anxiety, or depression? And then maybe how you would consume it, whether it's a tea or a salve or tincture or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I can think of a few different come to mind that utilized in that way, but from different regions. So um, one plant that comes to mind is chexw. So that's Lomatium nudicale is the Latin name, and it's a sort of outdated name is Indian consumption plant, or sometimes it's called wild cell. It's in a family that is one of those families that you do not want to mix up your ID, because it's the same family as one of poisonous plants in our region. That being said, if you have connections within Indigenous communities, it's the seeds of this plant that can be burned, basically, to help support mental and spiritual and emotional health. The caveat to that is that it certainly is the relationship that's in place, often with these plants that it builds that meaning into them. So other plants that come to mind up in Sţawat territory in the Yukon, rhodiola is a plant that grows, very widely up there, kind of in the tundra ecosystem near Tombstone Park, so down the Dempster Highway. That has become quite widely available commercially. And it is a plant that, so you could find this likely in a already in a prepared form, so whether it be in a in a tea or a capsule, and this is a plant that has specifically been utilized to aid in treating depression and insomnia, as is valerian. That's another plant that is quite similar in the fact that you can probably find that fairly easily in a health food store or herbal medicine place. So those are some of the plants that I can think of. And then I think the power really in also building relationship with plants is simply just being in the presence of plants. A plant like wild rose, for example, just being around a wild rose plant of course this is very seasonal, but at the heat of the day, smelling the scent of that plant, maybe harvesting one petal and putting it on your tongue, and just letting that experience kind of ground you, is something too that I think really holds so much in terms of, especially at this point in time as humans, just the extra need for those grounding yourself in your natural surroundings, I think can be such a just an impactful thing to do. And so that could be even just going out and crushing some cedar, or having just a way to tend to yourself with that intention. But those are some of the plants that come to mind.
Thank you so much for that. We have another question here asking, is there a place or a plant that you are in relation with that brings you a special feeling of joy?
I think, yeah, like just so wild roses I just described fit that description, because it's such a it's a plant that I look so forward to throughout the spring, as you start to see the wild rose leaf out, and then you see it set the flower buds, and then as those buds start to open, it's really one of the most joyful and uplifting harvests. But like I say, just to be around those plants in that time of year, I think just really charges my my heart up, and is something that when I think back to it, even in the middle of winter, it has that same effect on me of grounding and up at the same time. So that would be one that really comes to mind.
Leigh, I wanted to ask you myself, and I know we've kind of touched on this throughout your presentation, but I'm wondering what your advice would be to a settler person who is interested in exploring harvesting plants in their area. I know there's, you know, aside from just being educated about it, there's obviously a cultural divide there. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that. Like maybe how would a settler harvest respectfully?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that, you know, in this time that we're in, and I'm speaking, you know, to kind of recent, um, you know, events in news and, you know, socio-political kind of climate in terms of racism, in terms of, you know, a wider recognition of what it really means to be living within a society that still, you know, reflects back to, you know, myself or other people of color, you know, reflects back a diminished version of themselves based on, you know, like the basically just, you know, impacts of you know, colonization and just the stereotypes and judgments and racism that still exist. I think a starting point, you know, the plants or an interest in traditional hunting practices, or, you know, whatever that interest might be. You know, in terms of plants, I always say in my courses that I teach that it's really important to start with that education piece, you know, with understanding, interested in plants. But, you know, if that feeling or that thought comes up, you know, it's a really great first step to say, but how do I do this well? If this isn't coming from my, you know, ancestral or cultural lineage, but I'm really interested in it, what are the first steps, you know, to do that in a respectful way, if that's, you know, what you're setting out to do? And I would say that that education piece is really important. The book resources that I mentioned all speak to that, and the chapter that I contributed to that recent book speaks to that. And I think it's really important to understand the impacts, the ongoing barriers that exist for many Indigenous people in accessing these plants, and to then from there look at, okay, you know, what is it that I can do? And sometimes what you can do, and I also practice this, is sometimes wild harvesting is not, you know, the option. Sometimes that's not the most respectful and reciprocal way to go about things. So sometimes it means, you know, finding other ways. I think that gardening, whether it be in a planter or if you have a larger, you know, outdoor space, you know, if there's particular plants that you're interested in or that you've seen in the wild, you know, are really intrigued by and want to sort of start building relationship with, I think, you know, purchasing those plants from a nursery and putting those into a space where you can observe them and sort of build your own relationships is a really great way to start. And then, you know, if you do have the ability to be, you know, if you are harvesting or growing a lot, say of nettle or something like that, you know, making those connections in your local Indigenous community is also a really great way of, you know, operating in an informed and open-minded and open-hearted way. And so often that could look like, you know, contact potentially the local band office, or maybe a person in the community that you know, or the elders, you know, coordinator, and saying, you know, I have a plant medicine, is there like for it? And so that's a way too of, you know, enacting that reciprocity with the cultural kind of stewards and people who've utilized those plants for thousands of years. So those would be some of the thoughts. And yeah, there's so many great resources in terms of the, you know, the educating around, you know, what it means to say decolonize practices, or you know, decolonize the ways that we look at our natural environments. But that kind of starts with that personal work of kind of checking in, looking for where are all of us, you know, our own blind spots are, where it is that we can educate ourselves further. And that is so important.
Thank you for that, Leigh. In your in your very gentle way, saying, sometimes uh, things might not be for us. Settlers have a hard time hearing that. I speak for us as a group. We often have a hard time hearing that something might not be for us. But I think it's so valuable to hear you say that education is the first step. And I think there are so many great resources in the Sea to Sky. There are so many places to get started. Obviously, I always love to mention the Squamish Styawat Cultural Center, and they have such knowledgeable staff, and there's so much to learn from them. Since we're talking about it, do you have, in this weird COVID time, are you teaching any public classes?
I am not really, aside from doing, a small selection of talk, another talk tomorrow night through Vancouver Art Gallery. That's a little bit different in terms of its topic. It's kind of looking at climate change and the role that Indigenous knowledge and cultural knowledge, place-based knowledge may plot conversation. And I will be teaching a course at UVic, potentially, it's a little unknown, as a field course, but that's, sort of, it's for people who, if you're registered in post-secondary and, are interested in that, a course that I teach in February. But other than that, it's pretty pared back this year.
We have one more question from the Zoom call, and I think we'll probably call it a night after that one. There is a question asking, is the traditional plant celebration at Totem Hall open to the broader Squamish community, or is it just for nation members?
Great question. Yeah, so of course it didn't run this year. We usually run it in May or June, but in the past it has been primarily for Squamish Nation community members. And then we have definitely opened it up to people who've reached out from the kind of Sea to Sky community. If you're working, in some capacity that's connected to this knowledge. But that being said, it's been sort of first and foremost for nation members and other Indigenous participants. But we have had people from the broader community attend as well. And so I'll be sure to, depending on how this year goes, I'll be sure to share any workshops or any kind of land-based offerings that may be coming up as we kind of move into the future.
Wonderful. Yeah, I believe the analogy that I was given, or not analogy, but the directions that I was given from some of the Squamish Styawat Cultural Center staff was, if the public is invited, you should go. That was thinking about things like powwows and things like that. If it's in the paper, if it's on a public Facebook page, check it out. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah, really. Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to just build, community connections, and for sure.
Wonderful. Well, one last question for you, Leigh. What is the best way for people to find you online?
Yeah, so you can follow Squalwyn on Instagram. That's and Facebook. That's sort of the most active place, I would say, for this, and also research related content. Like, I'll be sure to share, like I said, talks and whatnot there, and just lots of perspectives and reflections and photos and what. And I also have a personal website that is in need of some updates, but you can also contact me through that. And it has some more of my kind of research focuses and offering that page. And that's just leighjoseph.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Leigh. I've learned so much, and I think all of our audience members here have learned a lot as well. I will mention, while we're still on the Facebook live stream, and to all the fine folks here on Zoom, I do want to mention that in November, if you're interested in continuing learning about Indigenous peoples in Canada and broadening your horizons, we will be doing a book club reading 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. And so that, and even if you're not in Whistler, hey, guess what? You can come because it's virtual. So it's going to be a 3-week book club where we discuss a section of the book each Monday in November. And then, in fact, it's going to culminate in a discussion with Bob Joseph, which is very exciting. Anyways, if you want to know more about that, you can go to our website. You can email me anytime about programs, jbruce@whistlerlibrary.ca. It's going to be an amazing book club series and a really amazing time talking to Bob Joseph. I already have so many questions for him. Anyways, so we will say an official thank you to Leigh here, and we will say good night to the folks on Facebook.